Okay, welcome back for part B of the war in Vietnam. Here we are in lesson 11. And when we finished the first video, we were really talking about ramping up the U.S. becoming involved more heavily in the Vietnam struggle between North and South Vietnam. And we had just talked a little bit about the bombing campaign and Operation Rolling Thunder. And now things really start to heat up. Now it is that hasn't worked. That hasn't destroyed the North Vietnamese ability to wage war. And so the only thing left to do is to bring in troops. And so that's where we are as we pick up the story. So what does it look like? In March 1965, the first Marines land in Vietnam. And they are there to provide security for Operation Rolling Thunder. So they're there to make sure that the air bases are supported and secured. In August of 1965, we have Operation Starlight, which is the first conventional battle against the Viet Cong, where soldiers are going out into the field, trying to find the Viet Cong, which are these rebels in South Vietnam that are fighting against the American government, and are lining up and having an all-out war. In December of 1965, we have about 180,000 troops are in Vietnam. So that's a significant number of soldiers. We now are definitely there. We are definitely committed, and we are definitely, going to have to figure out how we're going to resolve this issue. It starts off by something called combined action, and the general who's in control of the Vietnamese army is a general named William Westmoreland, and he really wants the United States troops to assist and kind of fill out the South Vietnamese troops. We talked about how the South Vietnamese troops are not a particularly good army. They're not motivated. They don't want to be there. Westmoreland figures out that, if I can put in a few U.S. soldiers with the South Vietnamese, maybe we'll get something there. So we have combined squads. We also have a program called the Hearts and Minds, which is the idea that what we want to do is we want to go to the civilians in South Vietnam, and we want to show them why supporting us as opposed to supporting the Viet Cong guerrillas would be a good thing. We're trying to fight for their hearts and fight for their minds. So programs to help bring education, to help reconstruct villages, those type of things are thought of. It's a great idea. It doesn't work out at all on the ground. And the ultimate plan is that we would be able to turn over the war to the South Vietnamese army when they're strong enough, and we'd be able to leave at some point in the future. We'll see if that plays out. One of the first major battles where it was the U.S. versus the North Vietnamese was on something called Khe Sanh. And this took place in 1967 and 1968. And Khe Sanh was a patrol base, kind of an outpost, way along in the northern part of South Vietnam along something called the Demilitarized Zone. And the point of this base was to try to cut something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was simply that. It was a road that the North Vietnamese were using to bring supplies down to South Vietnam. And so the hope was that the Marines would be able to cut that road. Those supplies would make it to South Vietnam, and it would make it easier to fight the rebels in South Vietnam. So we had about 6,000 Marines that had to try to hold off about 20,000 of the North Vietnamese army during a 77-day siege. Ultimately, the army breaks through and ends the siege, but what it shows is that the North Vietnamese army is very strong, it's very well led, and they can stand in a direct fight with the best the Americans have to throw with them. So it's a bit of a humbling experience for the Americans. In 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year, which happens on January 30th, something called the Tet Offensive took place. And usually the North Vietnamese, or the Vietnamese New Year, had been kind of an opportunity for everybody to take a break. There hadn't been a lot of battles at that point. Soldiers went back to their families. However, the North Vietnamese took advantage of this, and in coordinating with the rebels in the south, the Viet Cong, launched coordinated attacks on the major population centers in the south. Ultimately, those attacks were failures militarily, but what it did was it really psychologically damages the U.S. and the South Vietnam army, because it shows that the North Vietnamese can attack wherever they want. And then there's images coming through the TVs back to America of people at the U.S. Embassy trying to fight the Americans, and it shows that the Americans don't have the same power that they thought they did. And it starts to weaken the resolve of the American public. The American public starts to question, why are we here? What are we doing in this little tiny country in the middle of nowhere? What's the point of us losing our troops over there? The Vietnamese War was an ugly war. All wars are, certainly, but we have a lot of atrocities that took place during this war. And some of them, as we've talked about before in Part A, really deal with what happened to the folks that are captured through Operation Rolling Thunder and the pilots that are shot down. And the North Vietnamese certainly tortured those pilots. They did so at a place called the Hanoi Hilton, which was a prison camp in the North Vietnamese capital of Hanoi. And here's a picture of John McCain, well before his running for president days, when he was coming back, when he made it out of the Hanoi Hilton in the 1970s. North Vietnamese weren't the only folks that committed war atrocities. One of the most famous atrocities committed by the Americans was something called My Lai, which was a town in South Vietnam. And in 1968, a platoon under a lieutenant by the name of Calley entered a village the village of My Lai, looking for Viet Cong soldiers. There were no soldiers there, but there were civilians. And the U.S. Army essentially shot and murdered over 300 civilians. And this massacre was covered up by the military for a number of years, so people didn't know about it. So, war is always an awful, awful thing. It brings out the absolute worst in humanity, of course, and we saw that in the Vietnamese War on both sides. In 1969, though, we have a new commander-in-chief. We have Richard Nixon, a Republican, who takes over from Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he decides that he is going to kind of reshape the way that the Vietnamese War has been fought. And essentially what he says is that he wants peace with honor. So ultimately the plan is to start turning over the war to the Vietnamese, to the South Vietnamese, start withdrawing American troops, but ultimately the plan is to leave with honor. So we're not going to leave until the objectives are met. We're not just going to cut and run. And that's the words that he uses. So let's talk a little bit about what this Vietnamization looks like. And it starts with peace talks in Paris between the North Vietnamese and the Americans and South Vietnamese, but those don't get very far. But the Americans do start to reduce troops by small amounts, pulling troops out and not replacing them. So our overall numbers of troops in Vietnam starts to decline. We also see U.S. commanders are instructed to minimize casualties. The idea of planes coming back with the body bags of soldiers is not playing well with the American public, so we're now taking less risks than we may have in the future in battle. And essentially what we see now is the U.S. and the South Vietnamese are starting to hit the North Vietnamese in neutral countries. That's also being covered up, and so that's a big question in terms of the legality of the war. And we see planes are bombing the North Vietnamese in foreign countries like Cambodia and Laos. And so there's questions about, what Nixon is doing. Even though he says he's trying to get out of the war, he's heightening it by actually taking it to 2 other countries. So a number of things are going on, and the public support for this war is getting worse and worse by the day. And ultimately that leads to the end. We have a peace treaty that's signed in January of 1973, and essentially it says that the U.S. will withdraw all of its forces, and the North Vietnamese would give up all the prisoners of war to America. And so that begins. Fighting resumes, however, in 1974 before the peace treaty goes into effect. And in August of 1974, the U.S. essentially decides it's time to leave and drastically cut aid. So they are, instead of giving huge amounts of money militarily, they start to cut that and withdraw the heck out of the troops, bring them back home. From April to May of 1975, all the U.S. troops and many of the Vietnamese that have been associated with the American Army are evacuated from Saigon, the capital of the South, as the North Vietnamese Army is taking over the city. So you can see a picture here of people trying to get on a helicopter to get out, essentially from the U.S. Embassy, as the North Vietnamese troops are coming in to take over the city. The North Vietnamese ultimately win the Vietnamese War, the Vietnam War. It becomes a single country, a single communist country, and becomes a rather significant stain on a number of presidents and on the U.S. as a whole. So we'll take a little more of a look as we're doing our reading this time in Vietnam, and then we'll talk to you.